Civil War. I'm going to talk about the Depression of 1873 and the Strike of 1877, how those two things are related, and what's weird about this Depression, because there's still a lot of debate among economists about whether there was a depression or not. So let's start where we were before with the greenback, the U.S. greenback. So this was an issue issued $450 million worth of greenbacks were issued by the U.S. government to basically pay for the war. They're also issuing U.S. bonds, over $1 billion in U.S. bonds, which is a lot of money in the 1860s, to pay for this war. And this U.S. greenback is gradually retired from 1865 to 1879. So for a while, it's what's called fiat currency, F-I-A-T, which is basically the federal government says it's real currency, but you can't turn it in for gold or silver. You could go to a bank and trade it for gold or silver, but they'll look at the gold prices and say, well, we'll give you, this much gold for it. But there's no established standard. You can't go to a national bank and get gold for it. The war is in the American Civil War, right? So this is the American Civil War is the issue. All of this currency is issued, and the greenback is gradually retired in 1865 when the war ends to 1879. What happens is the U.S. Treasury buys the notes back with gold, and the money supply shrinks as a result relative to the population, and we call this currency deflation. So basically, there's less currency per person over time because the U.S. is trying to curtail the amount of currency that's out there so that eventually they can get what's called resumption, which means that you can go into any national bank, turn over $2 and a $2 note like this and get $2 worth of gold at the stated rate that the U.S. offers gold for this currency. And so Fort Knox and these other places that you've heard of were the place where you could go, where this gold and silver was held. The U.S. was back on the gold standard by 1879, and that meant that greenbacks were tradable for gold directly. Okay, so that's deflation, currency deflation. There's another kind of deflation that's happening in this period, and that is price deflation. So it's not just that the currency is going down, the amount of currency. I know that on the gold standard, when you have a recession, your trading partners are supposed to send their gold to you, and it's enormously complicated. But can you expand on that? Yeah. So. So this is what I want to try to explain here. So when people talk about deflation, there's two kinds of deflation. There's currency deflation, and there's price deflation. And I want to talk about the trading a little bit later when I talk about international interest rates. So if I promise to get back to Jacob's question in a minute. But what we're seeing here is a drop in the money growth. That's the dotted line. That's what I was just telling you about. That's resumption. But we also see that U.S. consumer prices are dropping, and this is deflation. And currency deflation is probably not all that is going on, but let's think a little bit about what deflation is. We've seen very, very few periods in American history where we've had deflation. Where and if you look at this map, you can see that there's deflation in the 1870s. There's a dip in deflation. There's an increase in deflation in 1894, and then the Depression of 1929. So deflation is basically negative inflation, and deflation means that, let's say Megan Toomey. I see Megan Toomey at we go to, I don't know, the Chick-fil-A or something like that, and I'm out $20. I don't have any money to pay for a meal, and so I asked Megan to loan me $20 to pay for my Chick-fil-A meal, me and I guess my family, because $20 goes a long way at Chick-fil-A, and then 10 years later, at the reunion, your UGA reunion, I ran to Megan and she said, "Hey, where's my $20?" And I pay Megan back, and I also pay her interest. So let's say I pay her back $25. If $25 10 years from now, ordinarily, we would expect that $25 10 years from now is going to pay for more for less than a Chick-fil-A, right? We're used to inflation. We're used to our money being worth less and less over time. But if we had deflation from 2020 to 2030, that $25 might buy 5 Chick-fil-A dinners. Chick-fil-A for more than my family, but say Megan, her kids, and her grandkids. Yeah, so price deflation is the thing that's not healthy about price deflation, and the thing that's scary about price deflation is anybody who has a loan, right? If the money is worth more and more over time, you have to sell more and more things to get it. So if you're a farmer and you have price deflation and you take out a loan for $50 or $100 or $500, but you have to sell more and more of the product that you have because of deflation, because the dollar is worth more and more over time, you get what's called a debt deflation spiral. The people who have debts can't pay the debts because the money is worth more and more over time. Right. So the question, yeah, Jacob's question is this the shortage of money or is it technology? And no one knows for sure. No, there's a lot of debate among economists about precisely what causes this. But what we see in deflation, usually when we see deflation, we see a financial crisis and a depression. And the reason for this is because money is worth more and more over time. People who have debts can't pay them, and lots of people default on their debts. And so, for that reason, once the Federal Reserve was created in 1911, and it starts operating in 1912 onward, what they try to do is set the interest rate so that it's around 2% from then on, so that your money is worth a little bit more, a little bit less over time, but you're not surprised or shocked by that, and it makes it relatively easy to pay off debts. So if you pay at 3% or pay at 4%, you know that that your money is going to be worth a little bit. That's right. That it's going to be easier and easier to pay off those debts. Is that clear? So what you want is a little bit of inflation. The U.S. does not have a Federal Reserve, and so we have no easy way to set the interest rate. And so what we see is deflation in this period. And to some extent, we can lay that at the foot of the greenback, right? The greenback is being paid off, and so the currency is shrinking. But there's other reasons why you might have deflation. What else can cause deflation in consumer prices? What else can make money worth more and more over time versus goods? Are there things in your lifetime that have become cheaper and cheaper? And are there things that have become international trade, right? Electronics, good. So a TV that you would have bought 5 years ago, you might spend, or a computer that you bought 5 years ago, might cost you $1,500, and it's now worth today about $800. Phones are getting smaller and smaller, so there's certain kinds of technology where you expect that, yeah, that's international competition, but it's also returns to scale. So as you produce more and more phones, you produce more and more steel, you produce more and more other commodities. No, it's not directly the shorting of prices. It's basically it gets cheaper and cheaper to produce things. So remember with Carnegie's steel, Carnegie is able to produce roll steel rails for about $10 a ton in 1860. By 1870, it's $8 a ton. By 1880, it's $6 a ton. So improving the efficiency of creating those products, particularly for things that are easy to technologically advance and cheapen, those things are going to be cheaper and cheaper over time. The exploitation of labor is sort of a factor, but it's more, I think. So if you think about the cost of tuition, right, over time, the cost of tuition goes up over time quite a bit. The cost of medical care goes up quite a bit over time. In the last 10 years, the price of tuition and medical care have gone up. That's in part because There's very little technology involved in either of those things. They just require somebody to sit there and take your blood pressure. They require somebody to sit there in front of you in a classroom and teach. Those things, it doesn't get cheaper and cheaper to produce it. Other things like televisions or um, yeah, televisions or electronics in particular, that's the most kind of familiar ones, get cheaper and cheaper to make, and their prices go down over time. As capital costs decrease for production, doesn't the price slowly decrease? Uh, yeah, so capital costs decrease. Right, so the capital cost for this production decreases. There's international competition for things like steel and other things like that, and the price is going to drop. So there's a lot of debate among economists and things like that about what precisely causes this. But what we can say is that there is currency deflation, and there is also a deflation in prices. Oh yeah, it's this the well this so this chart is actually from the Federal Reserve Board, and they have a consumer price index, and it's really hard to say what these goods are that uh, it's really difficult to average overall prices and say whether we've had inflation or deflation. But I do think we've had more or less mild inflation from 2000 to 2020, I say over the last 20 years. That there was deflation in 2008 during the downturn. It was true that money was worth more and more. People were certainly hoarding cash, and that things got a lot cheaper. People were selling things at fire sale prices. But really, only for a few months did we see deflation in the consumer price index. And I'm sorry it doesn't go all the way to 2020. Um, and the Federal Reserve, our banking system, is trying. It's if there's a situation in which prices are dropping too fast, they will increase the money supply to stabilize prices, to prevent deflation. And the reason, again, you prevent deflation is not because you don't want things to be cheaper. We all like things to be cheaper, but to make sure that people's loans can get paid off. Yeah, it has the consumer price index is to make this even worse, the NBER, the organization that calculates consumer price index, is constantly changing what they measure. So milk and televisions and the price of a house and rent and all these other things are all changing relative to one another. So it's really, really difficult to draw an overall price index. But so this is what's happening: is we do see prices fall for things, and we do see the currency restricted. Okay. Now, what I want to do is tell you what I think was more important than either of those things. I think that to understand the Depression of 1873, those are things that economists have stressed, and economists are wrong, basically, about this. It's true that currency prices are going down, and there is other explanations for this. But the article that you read was my explanation for the sort of technological changes that explain the Panic of 1873. And to do that, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the world. Okay, to do that, we have to talk about one of the things that's taking place around the time before the Depression of 1873 is the Franco-Prussian War, and that is a war between France and Prussia, that is Germany, over over nothing really. The explanation for the war is patently ridiculous. Germany gets France, the Emperor Napoleon, to declare war against them on basically crazy and groundless purposes. But there is a mobilization that happens in July of 1870, and what you see here are the numbers, and the numbers are really important to understand. Alsace-Lorraine is the thing that's right, that's turned over from France to Germany. Basically, Germany masses on the border with 462,000 troops, um, basically within 18 days. An impossibly fast mobilization compared to any other previous war. That basically, they've been planning this for probably 5 years. and they can very quickly, in something called the what's it? Not the Liefen Plan, but this Etappen Plan, Etappen. They basically set up borrowing, in fact, from the United States, looking at the way that the U.S. Army, Union Army, mobilized troops very rapidly throughout the South during the American Civil War. They basically copy this um, method of troop delivery, and they create these sort of staging stations for the delivery of food so that they can send soldiers all the way to the border in 18 days, fully outfitted with their weapons, fully armed, with their food on their backs, just in the way that the United States had done during the Union Army had done during the American Civil War, and ready to march on France. France, by comparison, is kind of a mess in 1870. Napoleon leads the army on the Rhine towards the frontier with 202,000 men. Many of those people, though, had been gathering at different places in Paris and in other parts of France. They're not all of them armed. There's not enough food. It's a serious problem. And so, with basically 462,000 German soldiers and 202,000 French soldiers, the war is pretty much over fairly quickly. One thing that doesn't get mentioned, and I think is really important, is look up here in Antwerp. Germany, the plan was to deliver food in stages, steps, all the way from Berlin up here down into the border and then close to Paris so that they could engage in a siege of Paris. That whole system actually doesn't work very well. And in the end, Germany imports all of its food. The German staff officers, the first, second, and third armies, violate orders because the food is not there, and they buy their food in Antwerp. They end up buying American grain to feed soldiers so that they continue to move forward. This whole plan was supposed to be that Germany would provide enough food for itself to do this invasion. It actually fails, and ultimately it's food, the delivery of massive quantities of food, that make it possible for Germany to invade and surround France, and invade and surround Paris. So July of 1870, the Franco-Prussian War begins. In September of 1870, Napoleon III is captured at the Battle of Sedan. Food is how wars are won. An army travels through its stomach. The Paris Commune. So basically, Napoleon III surrenders. And at this point, he is an emperor, and he's been an emperor from 1849 until 1870, so about 21 years. When he steps down, there's a French Republic that basically emerges again, and they say, well, we're the French Republic. He may have surrendered, but France, the nation, will continue. And so the French Republican period is fairly brief. The French Republic is defeated by German troops again. And at this point, Paris is surrounded, and a third group stands up to to claim to control, and that is the Paris Commune. And this is where you get communism. The Communist Party is really sees itself as this is an important moment for the Communist Party that had emerged in 1848 and didn't really represent anybody. But very briefly, the Paris Commune is an attempt by workers in Paris to sort of take over the city. So France surrenders a second time in Alsace-Lorraine, and the Paris Commune is still operating in Paris. And it's at this point, speaking of food, that France, and Paris in particular, runs out of food. It's surrounded. If we'll just go back very briefly to this image, Antwerp is where a lot of the food is coming in. Prussian troops basically surround Paris, and then French troops, actually French imperial troops, surround Paris, trying to stop the French Commune, trying to stop this an attempt, at a revolution in France. And it's at this point that France, the Parisians, are run out of food and are forced to basically they eat all the animals that are in France, including dogs and cats. The entire zoo is consumed by Parisian citizens in the space of a week or two. And then rat catchers are traveling around through Paris trying to find enough food to feed them. The communards, once the Paris Commune is surrounded, Um, the communists burn parts of the city, and there's a bloody suppression of the Paris communards, and almost all of the communards, the people who were participating in the Paris Commune, are surrender and are then killed. And the martyrdom of the communards becomes an important part of the Communist Party, both in Germany and in Russia and elsewhere. Okay, and that's when Alsace-Lorraine becomes an important part of it's basically France has to turn over Alsace-Lorraine to Germany, and Alsace-Lorraine is important because it's an important industrial area. Okay, so what that does, what the 1870-71 conflict does, is it makes capital markets a little bit confusing, very difficult. Because France is trying to blockade the English Channel to prevent Germany from supporting itself. The capital markets are in difficulty, and that's really important for American railroads because American railroads, remember, are issuing stocks and bonds, and the biggest buyers still are in Europe. And so a lot of people like Jay Cooke, who is at the head of the Northern Pacific Railroad, is in a position where he's trying to issue bonds and sell those bonds in Europe, but the Franco-Prussian War makes it very difficult for him to sell these stocks and bonds. Jay Cooke is the person who had come up with this idea of selling American bonds in the United States, but he ultimately will fail in September of 1873. Now, a couple of things that are going on in Europe also in 1870, 71, and 72 is there's a massive buildup in the capitals of the three empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is based in Vienna, the Prussian Empire, which is based in Berlin or centered around Berlin, and the French Empire, which is centered in Paris. Each of these have created a series of building and loan banks which are loaning people money for building construction downtown. They tear down all the major city walls that had surrounded those old medieval cities, replacing them with big, wide open vistas like this one, the Ringstrasse in Vienna. And you can have these sort of half-built homes that you can get mortgages on, and a lot of banks are issuing mortgages to these firms. But the whole international geography of trade, though, as I've suggested in the past few weeks, is changing as America is exporting a huge amount of wheat to these places. And these building and loan banks are all sort of premised on France being able to feed itself, Germany being able to feed itself, and not needing gold to feed itself from other places like the United States. But that's not the case. The French Empire, the Prussian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire all are increasingly interdependent on this other place across the ocean, the United States, which is shipping grain at very, very cheap prices. Basically half the prices that they had been in the 1860s. What this means in terms of farmers in Germany, Austria-Hungary, and France is those farmers can't possibly compete with the cheap grain that's coming from the United States. So these changes that take place, this is the Bank of England rate. And so this peak in July of 1870 this is the rate that banks lend to each other, the price that they charge to each other to borrow money. This is the Franco-Prussian War here. And then as the banks in Austria-Hungary, Vienna, Paris, and Berlin start to be shaky in May of 1872 and 73, what we see are these spikes in the interest rate. And what that means is that banks are not trusting other banks. The Bank of England in particular is concerned that other banks are in trouble. And so they raise the interest rate from the sort of standard of about 3% to about 6%. Then they drop it again. Then they raise it again to 6%, and they drop it again. They raise it again to 6%, and they drop it a third time, all in the space of about a year and a half. So what we see is the price to borrow goes up. Now, why is that a problem for somebody like Jay Cook? Why is that a problem for somebody like the Hatch family? These are the kind of they're the bankers of the 1870s. Well, the trouble with for those people is this is this red line is the Bank of England rate. This is the Bank of England is basically the closest thing we have in the United States to a Federal Reserve, but it's in England. And the Bank of England is setting the bank rate, but it's getting very crazy around 1873. The rate keeps going up. People like Jay Cook and people like the Hatch family, the sort of merchant entrepreneurs of the United States, are borrowing at the red rate, right? So they're borrowing from the Bank of England and other banks connected to the Bank of England at something like 2 to 3 to 4%, and they're lending in the United States at something like 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10%, right? So if you can borrow at 2% and lend at, say, 6 or 7%, then then you can make quite a bit of money, right? You can borrow millions at 2% and lend those same millions at 6 to 8%. A banker in the United States is in very good shape. The trouble is, a lot of the biggest bankers are holding these American bonds that they're trying to sell in Europe, and they find it very difficult to sell them in Europe. First, because of the Franco-Prussian War, and then, it's just difficult to sell them, and there's concerns about long-term lending. When the Bank of England starts to jigger the rate around, when it starts to raise the rate because it's scared, the reason you charge a bank more for its interest rate is the Bank of England doesn't trust the Bank of Vienna or the Bank of Berlin or the Bank of Paris, and so it's going to raise the rate. And so, well, I'll lend you, but not at 2%. I'll lend you at 4%, right? So the Bank of England loses trust in other European banks right around 72 and 73 when these mortgage banks start to be in trouble. And as a result, they raise the rates. Does that make sense? That's Gabe Babe's question, is that's why we see this red thing go up, is that the Bank of England is starting to lose confidence in the other banks, and it's charging those other banks a slightly higher rate. When I say slightly higher, it's going from 2 to 6%, which is actually quite a big surge in a fairly short period. It drops down, drops back, bumps back up again. This point, right where the red meets the blue, that's the Panic of 1873. Because all those bankers that had relied in a very kind of healthy way on there being a spread between the red rate and the blue rate, this is where they're screwed, right? Because bankers like, which banks do the Bank of England loses confidence in banks in France, in Austria-Hungary, and in Prussia, all around the same time. All of them are lending on these in this mortgage banking system, but they seem to be in trouble. This makes it harder for the average person to borrow, yes, and it makes it especially hard for those merchant bankers to borrow, because they're borrowing at right here. They're borrowing at 6%, but they're lending at right at the same amount. Okay, so how does this hurt Jay Cook and others? Well, he's holding these bonds, right? And so he has to borrow on the money market to keep them alive. He's got, say, $7.5 million worth of bonds from the Northern Pacific. He has to unload them fairly quickly. It's difficult to unload them because of the Franco-Prussian War. He's holding on to them and he's borrowing on this sort of money market rate, right? But the money market rate starts to spike in 72 and 73. And so he can't, so eventually, people in the United States are borrowing at, right, a solid rate is around, what's the average around here? Is around 8%, 8.5%. It spikes to 12% in January of 1873, and it spikes to 17% in July of 1873. And that's basically people going nuts and not wanting to lend to anyone. So it's not good. No, it's what's happening is that this gap between the red and the blue is where those merchant capitalists are super happy. And the bigger the gap, the better they are, because they can borrow at 2 and lend at 8. But once they touch, then things are in trouble. Once these rates really start to spike and they have to borrow on and the borrowing rates in Europe increase, the borrowing rates in the United States start to shoot up, and this is the Panic of 1873. It's a problem if the borrowing and the lending rate, or this, if the British borrowing rate is so high that it gets near the American borrowing rate of 7%. So it's not exactly that they're touching; it's that this rate has shot up in such an unexpected way. If we were to go all the way through 1914, the rate would be basically in here. So this period is the danger zone when the Bank of England starts to raise rates because it's scared of other banks. And that's where the Panic of 1873 begins. And so, in a panic, what you want to do is hold cash, right? Because cash is worth more and more over time because of deflation. And so, what happens is that people are withdrawing cash from banks, and banks themselves are collapsing. This is a bank in Russia. And what we see here, this is a painting of a bank in Russia, and the image here is of people rushing to the bank to try to withdraw their funds. It's a classic bank run, and there's one person who's sort of walking away who's sort of walking away from the bank. That's Russian for bank up here, and this in a kind of, it's difficult to sort of figure out, but in the sort of visual vocabulary of the Russian period, this is a Jew. This is a Jewish man who's walking away, who's gotten his cash when everyone else is in trouble. And so this anti-Semitic thing, this anti-Jewish sentiment emerges in Russia, also in Germany, and elsewhere as people blame Jews for this crisis, people who have cash and seemingly have benefited by the crisis. Now, in fact, lots of Jews lost a lot of money in this period, but there were some international capitalists who quickly were able to, go to cash very rapidly to cash in all their funds. Those people are not in the United States. Okay, so this is the funny thing about the Panic of 1873, is that the U.S. is doing extremely well. In fact, the U.S. doing extremely well is partly the reason that Germany, France, and Austria-Hungary are in trouble, right? Because they're having to pay for all this cheap food that's coming from the United States. So you would think that the United States would excel and do extremely well in this period because of this drastic sea change in where food is coming from. But in fact, the opposite happens, and it's largely because the U.S. is borrowing in Europe, particularly England, and the chaos in Europe ultimately comes back to bite these capitalists in the butt in 1873, because the rates have gone up so quickly, and then the borrowing rates shoot up, so that the price that people demand to lend money on a short-term basis, which is like Cook and others, is so high, 17%, that it's impossible to really borrow money, and very likely that your bank is going to fail and collapse. And this is what the Panic of 1873 is. There was a bank panic in May of 1873 in Berlin. That is right there. There was another bank panic in Austria-Hungary shortly after that, and another bank panic. This is the American panic. And so what happens is that there are these other panics that precede it, but the serious panic hits the United States a little bit later than May of 1873. It hits in September of 1873. Okay, so that's the Panic of 1873, and so the crucial thing, I would argue, is not the amount of gold in the system, and the crucial thing is not the technological expansion that makes things cheaper and cheaper over time. Those are the things that economists stress. The thing that I would argue that was most critical in terms of starting this panic is really the money market rate, the rate to borrow. This is why when I wrote this piece, I've got lots of when I wrote the piece for the Chronicle of Higher Ed, it was published, and the Chronicle asked me to name 3 things that might happen if that was true, and I said, there'd be a run on cash, and companies that had lots of cash on hand would be the ones in most trouble, and the denomination of the currency might shift from dollars to renminbi and things like that. All that stuff started to happen after my article came out. within a few days. And it's at this point that a bunch of banks started to write to me and say, why don't any of our economists know about this issue? Um, uh, it is people who are profiting from the gray market. There's was it. I'm not sure what it though is. Different people borrowing. Yeah, the people who profit from the grain market are people who are grain traders. The people who are hurt by the grain by that same grain market are people who are lending, like mortgage lenders and things like that. So there are different people that benefit and hurt in this period. Okay, so this is the Panic of 1873 and the Depression of 1873 to 77. Now, there are some economists who say, well, look, the money supply went up and look, gold went up and whatever, this is not really a depression. In fact, hundreds of banks fail in this period. The unemployment rates are difficult to measure, but there's something like 25 to 30% in most cities. Um, it's difficult to say. I would say what I argued is that the banks that succeeded are the ones that were actually sitting right on top of the grain trade, sitting right on top of the beef trade. That those banks were in good shape, and that's why Morgan's bank, J.P. Morgan's bank, succeeded while Jay Cook's bank failed. Jay Cook's bank was connected to railroads and long-distance international trade. Morgan's bank was much more directly in grain and beef and did much better. So some banks succeed and some banks fail. And this is why, when you get a credit card, it says JP Morgan on it and not J. Cook, is that Morgan is the one that succeeded in this period. So this is the Panic of 1873. Large numbers of tramps and hobos travel around the United States. And people traveling by railway car without jobs. And remember, this is an era in when without unemployment insurance, with no Social Security, and probably the hardest hit are working poor in urban areas. It is a weird kind of depression, though, for people like Andrew Carnegie, because Andrew Carnegie is in a situation where he can buy his competitors at at fire sale prices, at 10 cents on the dollar. And so Carnegie Steel becomes the sole survivor in the battle between steel mills in Pittsburgh and elsewhere because he's sitting on a lot of cash. He has guaranteed contracts with the Pennsylvania Railroad to provide them steel at what's a pretty good price of $4 a rail, but it's getting cheaper and cheaper for him to produce the rail. So it's $2, $1, 50, 75 cents. It's cheaper and cheaper because of his Bessemer process to produce these things. But he's got a guaranteed contract with the railroad that extends for multiple years, and so he's got a flow of cash that other people don't have, and as a result, he can buy up his competitors. The same thing with Rockefeller. Rockefeller has long-term contracts with railroads and others. That allow him to basically buy up his competitors. As you can see from this image from Harper's, there's tremendous sense that some people are benefiting from the crisis, especially people like uh, Carnegie and others, but many people who are sort of destroyed. Okay, so 73 to 77 is widespread unemployment, lots and lots of banks failing, and now we go back to, we're going to revisit again the Hayes election of the Compromise of 1876. We talked about this before, the election of 1876, in which Hayes probably lost to Tilden. But remember, there's this north-south battle over who's going to win. And Thomas Scott, who's the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, is at the head of, or connected with, this attempt to choose the president. And Scott is pushing strongly for Hayes in this sort of deal that's supposed to take troops out of the South. Once Hayes comes into office in 1877, and he keeps sending legislation to pay for the support of the Army back to Congress. But Southern Democrats who participated in the Compromise of 1876, or the Compromise of 1877 for the election of 1876, believe that they didn't get everything that they were promised. And so Democrats filibuster, they control the House, and they refuse to pay the Army in 1877. Officers and enlisted men in the U.S. Army are not paid anywhere in 1877, and then Tom Scott makes a very bad move. Around April of 1877, Scott cuts wages on the Pennsylvania Railroad by 10%. Once he does this, the other railroads do so. He reaches an accord with the railway engineers, the people on the right, those kind of people who are the sort of elite among railroad workers, as you can see from this image. They're the ones with suits and ties and things like that. The freight handlers, the firemen, the brakemen, and the others are left out. The fireman is not somebody who puts out fires, but somebody who puts in the coal into the train. The brakemen obviously hold the brake. The freight handlers are the people who move goods on and off the train. And out of the Pennsylvania Railroad, a new organization emerges called the Trainmen's Union. It's open to all workers, not just firemen or brakemen. So previously, unions have been organized by craft. So the firemen were in one union, the brakemen were in another one, locomotive engineers in another one. But the Trainmen's Union was open to everyone, and they bound together by secret rituals. Unions were not unlike social clubs, and they were burial societies. So you paid money into this union, you hid your membership, just like in a fraternity, or you hid the secret oath of your organization. Unfortunately for Tom Scott, Tom Scott then, to try to figure out where these unions are and are operating, hires Alan Pinkerton of the Pinkerton's Detective Agency to try to investigate who's in the union so that he can fire them. And Pinkerton goes through the Pennsylvania Railroad and does identify some of the brakemen and some of the engineers who are in this union, but not all of them. And by then, it's too late. Private detectives are a new force in the Gilded Age. They try to join the Trainmen's Union. They try to determine leaders and try to tell the Pennsylvania Railroad to quickly fire them. But by then, May of 1877, the organization has spread to other lines, including the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Then in July of 1877, on the Baltimore and Ohio, many firemen began stepping off the trains. And if the fireman steps off the train, the engineer just can't continue, because the fireman is the person who feeds the coal into the engine, and if you don't have someone to feed the coal in the engine, the engine can't go. So the firemen begin stepping off their trains and the dozens of cars piled up, as they do here in Martinsburg, West Virginia, as you can see in this image. Lots of local people, women, children, families of the strikers, opponents of the railroad, people who are just angry at the railroad join in, and it becomes a kind of mob scene in Martinsburg, West Virginia, particularly at railway hubs. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a railway hub for the Pennsylvania Railroad, there's general rowdiness. Buildings are broken into. So what starts as a strike turns into a riot, and then what's called the Great Uprising of 1877. Many folks hate these new corporations like the railroads, as you saw in the Octopus. It wasn't just rates, it was also that these passed through many cities at 40 miles an hour with no signals and no road blockers, killing kids and horses day and night. So, we're used to signals and all these other sorts of things and people blowing their horns. There's nothing like that in this period. And so it's very easy to sort of die if you're not watching for the railroad coming through. And so there's tremendous anger in people in cities at these railroads. The timing, though, is significant. And here's the problem. The battle between Hayes and the Democrats has become bitter, and the Democrats have stopped all military appropriations. So there are federal troops in July of 1877, but most of them haven't been paid for months because of this conflict in Congress. So in Baltimore, Maryland, where this conflict happens, the Maryland Regiment was willing to fight strikers, but they were so angry at not having been paid that they actually fire into the crowd and kill a dozen people. The West Virginia army that's brought in to sort of put down the strike refuse, and they disband rather than shoot at strikers who are their own cousins and brothers and family members. In addition, Hayes's public image is not good, because many Northern Democratic newspapers say that the only reason he has the presidency is because Railroad President Tom Scott gave it to him. In mid-July, Hayes calls out federal troops to put down the strike. There are pitched battles then by July in Pittsburgh and Baltimore and Albany and Martinsburg. Only New England and the Deep South are excluded from this warfare. In Pittsburgh, sympathy strikes by miners and steelworkers follow. Trains are driven over embankments or straight into the shops. Boilers are spiked so that they can never be used again. There are general strikes in Chicago and St. Louis. More problematic for the perspective of men like Scott is that many of the federal troops supported the strike. They refused to raise their rifles, they abandoned their posts, and many of them joined the strike. Hayes had no clear guidelines, and so many you see chaos. So the result of the Panic of 1877 is not a revolution like you see in Paris. Why? Because workers are actually bitterly divided in the North, right? As we saw before, between Democrats and Republicans. If they're Catholic workers, they're Democrats. If they're Protestant workers, they're Republicans. And so workers themselves, while they have lots and lots of grievances against these companies, are also pitted against each other in most northern cities because they're riven by ethnic conflicts, ethnic divides that put the Irish Democrats against the Irish Democrats and the German Catholic Democrats against the German Protestant Republicans. And so it's at this point that the National Guard is created. Alex's question is great. So this National Guard after 1877 is created, and these are National Guard headquarters. They're basically military encampments that are created. And we get a professional National Guard that's equipped with modern weapons. They're going to be used 100 times over the next 25 years. Armories are constructed in major cities in the North to ensure that troops are on hand for later strikes. Okay, so the result is a growing fear of immigrants and workers lead to the growth of a National Guard. They're not a dangerous class like the Paris Communards because there's almost no political force that binds the immigrant Catholic workers and the Northern Protestant workers. The Depression was little understood in 1873 to 1877, and I argue it's little understood now. It led many people to blame the Tom Scotts and the Andrew Carnegies. When we get to the Depression of 1893, there's going to be a new villain, and that's going to be the gold standard. And it's going to be basically people looking for inflation and deflation as the cause of these panics. But what the more important source of these panics is kind of international transformation in trade and the sort of attempt to deal with a kind of new world order in which the United States is providing grain for the rest of the world. All right, thanks so much. Sorry to have gone over a little bit, and I'll see you guys on Friday on Zoom. Thanks.